Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takaishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast. Today I am joined by one of my friends and fellow music therapists, Jennifer Townsend. Jennifer Townsend worked for over a decade in pediatrics and now works as the manager for the creative arts therapies at Houston Methodist here in Houston, Texas. She is also an instructor at the University of Houston for their Arts Leadership Program and serves with me on the Texas State Task Force for Recognition of the MTBC. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's really always exciting and super special to have fellow music therapists because we get to dig in not only to the science of what we do, but how we came to this wonderful profession. So how did you end up being a music therapist?
Yeah, I feel really lucky because my story begins earlier than many people I've met in the field. My high school guidance counselor was aware of music therapy and able to introduce music therapy to me at an early age in my high school years. So I think I learned about music therapy my sophomore year of high school, and I was able to do an independent studies on music therapy as one of my English credits and spent some time interviewing music therapists and really digging in. So I was set from the time of graduation, and I knew what I wanted to do.
That's nice. And it must have been a bit of a relief of that burden, knowing where you wanted to go in life. And then, of course, not only doing that, but doing that so successfully at your level. I mean, you've given presentations and you've researched and you've become such a cornerstone of the music therapy community here in Houston. So I am wondering, what is the most surprising thing that you've learned in our field so far?
I think early on, I remember being surprised about so many different populations that I didn't know we could work with. Deaf and hard of hearing is one that you get asked questions about often as a music therapist. Can you work with people that are deaf or that have hearing issues? And the answer is yes, we can. But I think that was probably one of the first kind of like, wow, okay, this goes beyond what I thought it did early on. I think as we are growing our knowledge base in the neurosciences now and have better access to things like fMRI and technologies that can show us a little bit more about the inner workings of the body, I think I'm fascinated by learning, and I don't know if it's really music-based specific, but the basic science behind what's happening in the brain and then applying that to the field of music therapy.
That's fantastic. And that's an area that I personally have an interest in as well, the neuroscience. How does our body and brain work like that? What happens when we listen to, our favorite music or a new piece of music or something? Like, I love that so much. Is that an area that you'd say you're probably most curious to learn about right now?
I think I'm most curious to learn about what is really happening in our minds, in our brains, in our cellular system when we have a disorder of consciousness or when we are medically sedated. That's kind of the area that I'm most fascinated by at the moment. And it's an area I've been interested in. Disorders of consciousness has been something I've followed fairly closely throughout my career. I worked with children in a long-term acute care setting that many of them were considered in a persistent vegetative state or in a low awareness state. And so disorders of consciousness has always been something very fascinating and interesting to me to learn about. But I think where neuroscience is bringing us is to start understanding some of the changes that are happening to our body when we go under medical sedation or in a coma or these different things where we have these anecdotal experiences, especially from music therapy, where people experience hearing things while they're in a coma and then they recover from coma and they can report back that they've experienced these things, right? I remember you talking to me. I remember this song. I remember these things. And so trying to understand more about who is able to access hearing and thought and these different things during a low awareness state. And what does our brain do to try and reconcile what it is that we are hearing when it doesn't make sense, when it's not a familiar something? And how does that affect the healing process? And what might music therapy be able to do to combat that?
I love that our field can work with so many different communities and populations. And I love that we can delve deeper into what you were just talking about. For me personally, that just lights me up and makes me so excited to not only learn more myself for our field, but just in general for how far we can go with helping people on the road to recovery after things like various medical events that have happened.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's maybe more research in that lately, or is it something that it just depends on what people's niches are?
Yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily more research into that area. I think it kind of was reignited for me during COVID. So I mentioned having worked in long-term care pediatrics, where I very much worked with a lot of children that had disorders of consciousness. And then I was kind of in the acute care world for a while in trauma response and ICU. And then during COVID, we started having these long-term medical sedation patients, right? People were being sedated for weeks, even months at a time in order to try and get them to survive the disease. And so there was a need arose for caring for people in a sedated state and understanding what that looks like. We received many, many referrals during COVID from nursing staff. And honestly, I think the nurses were probably reaching out more for themselves than even their patient at that point. The referral was for their patient, but they didn't really have a reason. It was like, hey, can you come? I don't know what we need. Just can you do something, right? I'm at a loss to do something. And once we started digging into that and asking questions and trying to understand, where is all of that coming from? We learned that some of it was really coming from the nurses that were feeling like they no longer had a person they were treating. They were treating a body, and that was really disconcerting and hard and painful. They came into this field to help people, and they're used to speaking to those people and learning about those people and hearing about their stories and meeting their family members, and all of those things were taken away during this time. And so some of it, I think, was that, but obviously the referral was to treat the patient. And so we needed to discover, was there something we could do for the patient? And so, I was really drawn and led to dig into my past when I had worked in disorders of consciousness and really bringing to light some of those practices and thoughts, which led to developing a protocol that we're calling the PSMSP, positive stimulation for medically sedated patients. And so during COVID, we really developed this protocol where we would utilize an adapted form of the MetaDoc, and we consulted with Dr. Wendy McGee on this. We kind of used an adapted form of the MetaDoc for assessment, but then we pulled in the sung name portion of the MetaDoc at the beginning of the protocol. And so we would sing the patient's name, usually in a triad, and then we would collect stories from family members, these positively salient, sensory-oriented stories. The example I like to give is, hey, Mom, remember that time that we went to the beach and it was really cold outside, but we were determined to find some sea glass. And so we walked and walked until we found the beautiful blue and green sea glass that was perfectly smooth on all sides. We brought it back to the house and we put it together and made a wind chime. What a wonderful day. I just love thinking about that day. I love you, Mom. Close. And then we would pair that with a positively salient, familiar song that was important to that relationship or even to that specific memory. We know that music can evoke memories and evoke emotion. And so we would pair it with that. And then this kind of process of story song would go back and forth for a little while, about 20 minutes. And then we would close by having a next of kin family or friend record a short comfort message message, and we would coach them on the comfort message. We wanted them to be really focused on positive and helping the confused brain to really not be activated in further anxiety. Under the theorization that when you're in a sedated state in the ICU with a brain that is maybe sluggish at best because of the sedation medications, it may be confusing and alarming to the brain to hear things like, keep fighting, you're going to get through this, you're going to make it. Very well-intentioned phrases, but could be confusing or alarming to someone if they didn't know that they were in the hospital, or what is it that I'm fighting here? Or, that's this kind of confusion. And so we would coach them through some really simple, loving phrases. And then that would be the end of their recorded playlist. And by having it recorded, we reduced the amount of time that the therapist needed to be in the room. And we were able to provide it more frequently. And so the nurses actually would provide it 3 times a day during COVID. And then as people came out of sedation, we were able to talk to them about those experiences, if they remembered anything, if it was meaningful for them. There were patients that remembered it. There were patients that were able to say yes, and it was so meaningful. There were patients that listened to it after, that didn't remember hearing it during, but were very touched and moved by it after the fact. And then there were patients that didn't survive, and it became a legacy for the family. And so there were secondary benefits for the families. There were secondary benefits for the nurses because they started hearing patient stories and family members, and it kind of brought the human back to what they were doing and who they were treating. But it led to some interesting conversations with some of our research institute folks. And one of the most interesting for me was, that kind of leads me into this path, was speaking with an epigenetics. And he brought about the fact that in these states and in the ICU, and this noxious stimulation that's hitting us all the time, that we're experiencing in an environment like that, especially during COVID, when familiar voice and familiar smells and all of these things are not coming into the room because we don't have people visiting us, that these can actually have effects on the cellular person, like all the way down to our epigenetics, and can have this long-lasting negative effect where we can live from a psychology standpoint. We understand this aspect of being activated in fight, flight, or freeze, and being chronically activated in that space, and how that can then be more difficult to come out of later, that our body retrains itself to be in that state and then requires some help and some assistance getting us out of that state. Well, looking at that from sort of a cellular space, from a neurohormonal space, it makes sense that we would have similar responses in the body. And so starting to try to understand, and I say try, that's a big try, to understand what all of that means, because it's not my world, right? I am not a neurophysicist. I'm not a neurologist. I don't know half the things that they're explaining to me, and they have to explain it to me over and over again. But the hope is that we'll be able to put together a study that really looks at those changes, those neurohormones, and what is happening in the body. And then what happens then when we combat that noxious stimuli with a positive, emotionally salient stimuli, such as music therapy? And can we then reduce, in the end, the goal would be to reduce delirium post-sedation, right? So the brain that is confused under sedation and is confused coming out of sedation, that leads to this state of delirium and can have long-term effects in the world of cognition and dementia and even morbidity. How can we utilize something like a positive stimulation tool through something like music therapy to see if we can make a change there? That's kind of where it's led me back to, I guess. That was a long roundabout way to say I got back into it during COVID, back into that world during COVID.
I appreciate you sharing those stories, though, and such beautiful and profound work that we do across the profession. But it's always so meaningful to hear, especially when it's people who are medically fragile or in those sedated states that you mentioned, because I'm not saying it's more or less meaningful, but it just seems to be very impactful. And especially during the pandemic, when it was such a difficult time for so many. And I'm happy to hear that you were able to provide that for people and to, like you said, bring the humanistic aspect back to the situations that you were in.
I feel honored that I was in a space that was able to continue doing that as well. I know many of our colleagues were not able to continue practicing during the pandemic for a multitude of reasons, whether it was financial or because the hospital determined that they were needed elsewhere for float pools or check-ins. And there were just so many things that we needed to do during the pandemic to keep people safe that oftentimes we were pulled from our regular clinical work. And so I'm very honored that our team at Houston Methodist was able to continue doing the work throughout the pandemic.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link. What is something about the career field that is one of your favorite parts?
One of my favorite and one of the things that can also become cumbersome, it's advocacy. And you know this, you're on the task force as well. And beyond even the task force work, just the day in, day out education of what is music therapy and the misinterpretations of what it is that we do or what we've studied to be able to do what we do and those types of things. I really enjoy that part. I really enjoy sharing the passion of the field with people and then bringing that into the legislature and helping them to see how needed music therapy is in the community and how the training really is vital to the practice of music therapy and that people need access.
100%. You and I are both very, very passionate about what we do and our careers and are so steeped in them. But obviously, there's times when we need to just step back and get back in touch with ourselves. What are some ways that you reconnect with who you are from a creative standpoint?
You know, I think the best way for me is to go camping. When I go camping, I'm able to really disconnect from the world, right? Like the phones and the computers and all of those things that help me to stay out of it for a little bit. But then I'm out in nature and I'm able to really experience fresh air and go on hikes and look at nature and study bugs and leaves and plants and all of these different things that aren't part of just like the daily life. And it seems like time really slows down when you're camping. And so camping is really enjoyable for me. And I think that camping is creative. There's a lot of creative aspects to it, right? You're camping and we're tent campers. So cooking on a fire and having to exercise, imagining how are we going to do this and what are we going to do and, you know, what are the best meals and how all of these things, where are we going to get the wood, just the little things from cooking to I have children. And so when we go camping, we may have a nature walk where we're doing a scavenger hunt or we're looking for particular things to create a craft or seeing what we can see, just enjoying the walk itself, all of those different aspects. So camping is kind of my biggest thing, my biggest self-care. Like if I'm going to go big, do something, really need to get away, I'm feeling the burnout, I go camping.
That sounds lovely. And it definitely sounds like a wonderful way to reset. Are there any places that you've not camped yet that you really want to?
Well, there are places across the nation that I want to go. You know, I really want to do a good long camping trip. I want to go to the sand dunes in California. I want to check out a lot of California. I want to bring my kids to the Petrified Forest. I went as a child, but I want to go and camp there now, you know, as an adult. Yeah, lots of places outside of Texas, but nowhere close that I haven't quite gotten to yet.
Nice. Are you a s'mores person?
I am not a s'mores person. Just, I guess, probably contraindicated for camping, but no one in my family is a big s'mores person. We can go camping without ever making s'mores and we would be perfectly happy. But we do make cinnamon rolls over the fire. Mm-hmm. I don't eat them. I eat an autoimmune paleo diet, but my family eats them and they really enjoy making cinnamon rolls over the fire. So
that sounds like a wonderful experience. I'm going to just jump on your next camping trip.
Yeah, come on. Come with us. We're actually camping next weekend for the eclipse. That'll be our next camp out. So, yeah.
Nice. Way to make a memorable time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm excited for it.
Yeah. Hopefully the weather's good for it too.
I'm hoping so. It's been beautiful these last couple of days. So maybe it'll stick around for the next week.
So back to a more serious question. I was wondering, what are your favorite and least favorite parts about the creative process? And whether it's work-related creative process or just fun, leisurely related creative process?
Yeah. Least favorite is technology, for sure. I understand its value and I know that it can do amazing things for us. I'm not good at it. So it's probably least favorite is dealing with technology and getting things to sound the way I want them to sound, be the way I want them to be. And I think my favorite things about creativity is probably the release of emotion and the release of kind of just letting go and going into another space for a while and also connecting with other people. I really enjoy making music with other people in a very informal way, not for a concert, not for, rehearsal, but just in a very informal process of coming together and hanging out and just singing some songs.
Nice. Yeah, it is fun to just jam with people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that whenever we used to have in-person music therapy conferences, doing those late night jams were some of my favorite things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those were good times.
I hope that we get back to that someday.
Me too. There's so many people in our profession that I miss and I only ever see them at conferences,
Right. Yeah.
If we were to sneak a peek at your music collection from high school, what are some things we'd find on regular rotation?
So I have an older sister. She's 3 years older than me, but it was enough to influence my music from her. And so I would probably have some Depeche Mode, the Cranberries.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes. So good.
Trying to think back to, so I've always had a lean towards Stevie Wonder. I mean, just for as long as I can remember. And then once I got out of high school, college, I really started listening to Stevie all the time. And he's still kind of my go-to person to listen to.
He's so great.
Yeah, he's so great. But yeah, Smashing Pumpkins. Who else? That kind of crowd, I think, would probably be the most in my 6-disc player as we had,
Yep. Oh, the good old days.
In there. Yeah. And then I was also influenced by my parents. So, Jim Croce and some of these older people. My dad listened to a lot of Randy Travis, Garth Brooks, Billy Joel, kind of a little bit of a mixture in there, I guess.
Nice. Sort of an eclectic.
Yeah.
Are there ever any artists that you find yourself loving that you learned about through Patience?
There are definitely songs that I have found through Patience, and oftentimes they're from other cultures, which is really amazing part. One of the amazing things about our work, especially here in Houston, there's just so many people. And prior to Houston, I was in Austin for a short stint, but then in New York before that. And so many different cultures coming together. And so getting to hear and learn music from other cultures has been really powerful for me. And I've found some things that I probably never would have heard otherwise. And so, yeah.
Nice. And what a wonderful treat, too, to learn about other cultures and ethnicities through their music.
Yes. Yeah.
If you had any advice to give to people who want to come into our field, what would that be?
I think right now that would be the people that I've met in our field that continue to grow and build and do, the doers, all have this passion that you and I have shared about. And so I think it's finding that passion and finding that connection. I would actually tell people to do that in any field, any career that they want to go to. I watched my husband go through a career that he really didn't enjoy and switching careers later in life to something that he absolutely loves. And his life is so much better for it. He likely makes less money, but it doesn't matter because he's happy type of thing. So do it for the love of what it is, of the value that it brings, of the way that music touches people and the understanding that we're gaining on that experience in human physiology and human neurology and psychology. Make sure you're doing it for that. Because if you're doing it for something else, then you're likely going to be disappointed.
That is excellent advice and very, very true. Yeah, definitely good to follow one's passions and natural talents for sure. Final question, in your own words, what does living a creative life mean to you?
I think living a creative life means tapping into our imagination and tapping into the freedom that we're given to explore. You know, there are so many different ways that we can reach the same ending oftentimes, and exploring those different ways and giving them a try, I think, is part of leading a creative life.
Wonderful. Jen, thank you so much for joining the show. Listeners, please check the show notes for links to her bio, as well as links to the American Music Therapy Association, where you can learn more about our wonderful profession. And as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.